Hello, I'm Professor PhD Antonio Sandu from Ștefan cel Mare University of Suceava, Romania, and today I will present the paper Medicalization of Social Life, Anxiety, Frustration and Ethical Risks. The purpose of the paper is to analyze the social construction process of the COVID-19 pandemic from the perspective of the anxiety and frustration felt by the citizens as a threat to their own lives and health, and also to analyze the perceived severity of the COVID-19 infection during March-June 2020. More specific, the present research aimed to understand the changes that society is going through in the context of the pandemic, to analyze the social construction element of the pandemic and also the infodemic in the context of the public health crisis, to analyze the manifestation of the anxiety and frustration during the pandemic, and to identify the social perception of the pandemic among the affected population. First of all, a few things about anxiety and frustration. Anxiety is a state of restlessness, a tense waiting, a negative respiratory phenomena, and so on. Frustration occurs when, due to inhibition of obstacle of any kind, include fails to fulfill a wish, satisfy a pleasure, and so on. Anxiety and frustration together occur, justified or not, when there are changes in life condition, when the level of quality of life to which the individual is accustomed diminished. The research context was SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, and it was during a period of quarantine of some locality, global lockdown of the population, obligation of social distancing, wearing a mask, emerging of individual behavior to such measures, feeling of helplessness, anxiety and frustration, fear, insecurity, and also other things that occur later, such as reject of vaccination and so on, lack of trust in public institutions, lack of confidence in public health, crisis of social communication, and so on. These two last situations occur both in the pandemic periods and in the periods that follow to those months where the shutdown of all the economy and all society was made. So we have some research assumptions. The coronavirus pandemic had a negative influence on the mental stability of an important part of the population and induced feelings such as anxiety, anguish, frustration. The lockdown measure imposed to limit the spread of pandemic will influence the prosocial behavior of individuals depending on the severity of their anxiety. So the social, cultural and economic transformation that the society registered during the pandemic leads to the sharpening of the medicalization of social life and to a rise of awareness that the current society is a risky society. Some theoretical approach. We make some consideration on social anxiety to the standpoint of social construction of reality, social construction of a pandemic. As a side effect of the process of social construction of personal identity, those being correlated with the cultural particularity of social environment of original mainly related to the social distinction between individualism and collectivism, as an instance for the social construction of idea of pandemic, as a constructive instance for a medicalization of social life in the pandemic and post-pandemic period. We consider the pandemic as being a socially constructed illness, not because it was not real. We don't deny the existence of the virus, as such as other theory of fake news and so on. But we consider that the problem of pandemic was also a social construct because it deals with communication, with how authorities communicate the situation, how authorities communicate with the people, with the institution communicate with the persons, and how the lockdown was announced, and so on and so forth. So we consider the pandemic as socially constructed through the mechanism of the interpretative adrift of a minimum of role performance, because we perform a role of persons in the society and so on, and we assume a roles of healthy or ill person and so on. But when all society is in shutdown, will be a problem of to performing such roles in society, to fail to perform such roles, and then it will be an interpretative adrift of those roles and how it could be made in a particularly part of the society. The idea of medicalization of society is very often connected with one of the risk society. It's not a medical society, actually is medicalized society. The medicalization of society is practically the effect of the risk society. Society is more easily aware of the various risks that individuals feel threaten them. More specifically, in last years, the comfort and the freedom of movement, globalization and so on, make us as a society and as an individual to be aware of the many risks that appear to be healthy, the risk to our health, or risk to our life, or to our well-being and so on. So we live in such society then that it's important to take care about all risks and emerge a society where treatments are more important than the previous society, and we call this medicalized society. The risk society, some things about what is the risk society. Risk is understood as the possibility that an adverse event may occur, summed up with the magnitude of its consequences. Not only health and the environment are endangered in our day, but also fundamental socio-political values, freedom, equality, justice, respect for individual rights and democracy. The medicalization of the social life brings with it a lifestyle based on sometimes exaggerated care for the health condition, on an increased consumption of pharmaceutical products, and so on. Few things about the social fear and social anxiety. Social interaction generate a constant state of stress for the subject to experience those interactions in a painful way. Social fear directed over time at the individual subjectively perceived as different. With really dysmorphic disorder, people with various disability or bodily dysmorphia with imagine dysmorphic disorder, this with the sick, and so on. Increase the social fear due to the media's mention of pandemics such as the Spanish plague, in the collective mind, the link with the plague by extrapolation. Sociology of the pandemic. It could be considered a new branch of sociology, and the social construction of pandemic must take into account the symbolic dimension and the interactive way in which the pandemic becomes a social reality. The role of the digital media, and especially of social networks, in the construction of the idea of the pandemic as a form of collective anxiety must be taken into account. The process of creating meanings, because social construction is no other thing than a process of creating of meanings. The intellectual elites and the significant one from the communicative points of view create meanings through the construction of emotions that legitimize a certain type of discourse and a certain narrative that allow the individual to familiarize themselves with an unprecedented social reality. For this paper we use methodology derived from grounded theory. The research was conducted in 2020 between March and June, in a period where in Romania, but also in the entire world, was shut down period, was a lockdown, and we are obliged to stay in the home, and it was very difficult to move from one place to another. The job was done at home, or was suspended at all, and so on. Data collection was done through the technique of semi-structured interview applied online. A sample of 103 people, mostly in the northeast region of Romania. It was an opportunity sample. The selection of the sample was made based on the snowball method. Most precisely, 31 participants was male and 62 participants female, and 7 participants unspecific. Age of the participant between 18 and 30 years, 73 participants. Between 31 and 45, 14 participants. Over 45 years, 11 participants, and unspecific, 4 participants. With the residence area, in rural areas 42 participants, in urban area 25 participants, and 36 participants lived in unspecific area. From education standpoint, 63 participants have higher education level, 31 participants secondary education, and 9 participants does not specify their instruction level. In grounded theory, we try to analyze the text of the interviews and to select some discursive categories, some topics that are frequent mentioned by in different forms by the respondents. And the first coding process is called open coding, or open coding stage, and we just try to understand the most important discursive category, where we can integrate the most of assumptions that were made by the participants. So first of it was the fact that information on COVID-19 viruses and pandemics and that was considered sufficiently informed versus misinformation was analyzed. Of course, some person considered sufficiently, some stress on the misinformation. Another subcategory is about communication with infected people, optimism and confidence and risks and so on. Second category, personal experience of infection with COVID-19 viruses. It's related to close people becoming infected, when this affects also the personal experience of COVID and the social construction of this pandemic, and when the close people died. The third category are the experience of communicating with person infected with COVID-19 viruses and the perception of the experience of those persons. There was traumatic experience. It was talking about empathy, joy for the ones that were cured, that were feel discrimination, social fear, severity of quarantine, direct contact with an infected person again, despair on health condition, and about the person they love, and so on. Fourth category, the subjective experience of quarantine social distancing. It's about lifestyle change, lack of adaptation, about diminution of hobbies. It was a time to return to introspection, spend more time with family. Its positive aspects that was taken into consideration by some respondents. Special events that was not, mostly religious rituals that cannot be done, and some of the respondents considered this a divine punishment. It was also a period of technical unemployment, lack of direct communication, monotony of activity, and sleep dysfunction, and so on. Five category, the perception of restrictive measure imposed by authority during the pandemic, overcrowding of the hospital. There was give birth to ambivalent perception. Disproportionate nature of the sanction measures was mentioned. Accepted and even appreciate the protection measure for some respondents, and the rejection of those for other persons. Fear of touching objects was mentioned as a problem, and medicalization of social life as considered a radicalization of oppression. The perception of existence of resource needed to overcome the pandemic, generally stress on lack of medical staff, distrust in medical system, especially in Romania was the interview was made, inefficiency of communication during the crisis, the need to find the person responsible, impact of the news, and slippage from normality. But some people say they are not extremely affected. It depends on how social life was made by these persons. And of course the problem of credibility of information source and infodemia was frequently mentioned. Availability of the source of information was considered being more important. The credibility of a source and the problem of the fake news. As perceived, the effect of the pandemic was a problem of appreciation of important things in life, acute awareness of the fear of death, social construction of responsibility, capacity for self-control over daily routine, perception of post-pandemic period, the hope of return of normal, of course, and to attempt to humanize the pandemic experience, increase the level of hygiene of individuals, reducing pollution during the pandemic lockdown, and the post-pandemic immediate recovery of sociability and social rituals was mentioned as very important, and there was made a critical evaluation of social risk, of sociability as a fundamental ethical and cultural value. It's also mentioned the virtualization of social space through working from home, radically change in work schedules, and so on. Pandemic and coronavirus conspiracy theory was also an important category, discursive category. Some people does not believe in the existence of SARS-CoV-2 inexplicable element of that are incorrectly explained by the authority, contradictory message and occult force and so on. Subjective perception of pandemic as violent and unexpected nature, the personification of pandemic and an almost anthropological force, subjectivized autonomy and magical mystical approach of rejection of the scientific approach. In the next phase of the research, we generate an axial coding, so we group in this category and we just make a model. Fear generated by the perceived risk of the pandemic, distrust in authorities' ability to manage the pandemic, awareness of increasing medicalization of society, distrust of the real dimension of pandemic, distrust in science, distrust in public health system and health authority, a general distrust in public authority, virtualization of social space, and destructuring sociability. Some bioethical reflection on the medicalization of social life. Contrary to the assumption that the appearance of anxiety and anguish during the pandemic should be very common, we can detect various explicit symptoms of this condition. Many subject answers were received by which the subject states that they were not or not very much affected by the pandemic. Of course, this could be understanding as also as the refuse of thinking about how they were affected, because the research was made in the period of lockdown. So if the person are very much in distress, they could refuse to admit this. They could be in the denial state. The main source of anxiety highlighted were related to the interruption of daily activity, quarantine, and the fact that people were forced to stay away from those close to them. The hope of returning to normal is, from our point of view, the attempt to humanize the pandemic experience. In this humanization of everyday life, a particularly important element is the elimination of fear from the forefront of relating to social life. And conclusion, the responsibility toward the others and toward one's own health condition is important. Results of the experience result in the pandemic. A dissociated society generates an anxiety of the other's presence, because this pandemic created a dissociated society, a society that are living in fear, and fear to one each other, fear to institution, fear to the virus, fear to go to the hospital, to not get infected, and so on. And the medicalization of society is an effect of perception of postmodern society as a risk society. And as a general conclusion of the research was that we have moved on another epoch based on what we call the virtualization of social space and interaction, and the virtualization affect family life. Thank you for your patience and interest in this communication. Again, my name is Antonio Sandu, and I welcome you to ask any questions you want by emailing at antonio1907 at yahoo.com, or to visit my website at antonio-sandu.ro. Thank you very much.